Welcome to Palisades Gold Radio. I'm your host, Tom Bodrovics. Joining me today is Professor Anthony Davies. He's an economist, speaker, author, as well as the co-host of the Words and Numbers podcast. Thanks for joining me today, Anthony.
My pleasure, Tom. Thanks for having me.
It's great to have you, and you're a little bit of an unorthodox guest, I would say, for us to have on our show, considering you're an economist and a thinker. But I'm really looking forward to this discussion, considering that I myself have learned a lot from your videos and your articles, just in the simple way that you really present your ideas and show the different sides to the way we go about thinking about things in the economy and just basically our everyday life here. So I think maybe a good place to start for today's discussion is to talk about first principles. So can you explain to our audience what thinking from first principles is and why it's so important? And we can get into some examples from there.
Yeah, it's important because and it's kind of the opposite of the way we do things. We tend to think in terms of outcomes. And you say things like, look, I think everybody should earn a living wage. And then we argue starting at that outcome. And the problem with doing things in that direction is that you can quite easily end up contradicting yourself because you haven't done the homework. That is, you haven't started at first principles. And first principles means not asking what outcome do you want, but asking what do you believe is fundamentally true. For example, I might say, look, I think it's fundamentally true that people should own their own labor, that when I go and I do some work, the work that I'm doing belongs to me, and I should be free to sell my labor to somebody else. And most people would nod and agree and say, yeah, that's right. People should own their own labor. Well, hang on a second, because if you agree that people should own their own labor, then all of a sudden, a lot of the arguments for living wage disappear. Because I could describe, for example, a situation in which an employer is offering me a job for less than a living wage. Maybe it's, let's say, $10 an hour. And I don't have work. I'm unemployed right now. And absolutely, I'd like to be earning $15 an hour. But that's not the option in front of me. The option in front of me is to remain unemployed or to take this job for $10 an hour. Now, if my labor belongs to me, I should be the only person who decides whether I will accept this job offer. And in fact, when we come along and impose living wage legislation, what the legislation actually says is, I, the worker, may not sell my labor unless I can get $15 an hour for it. And you can see that violates the first principle. And what happens is when we start at the outcomes, we often end up contradicting things that we would say are true, that we believe in, because we've started at the end rather than the beginning. So the best way to do this, I advise, is you start from first principles, what you believe is fundamentally true, and then follow the argument from there. And that will lead you to a certain conclusion about, for example, living wage.
Yeah, it's interesting. The way you phrase that makes me think about, looking at things for equality of opportunity rather than equality of outcome, right?
Yeah, and that's another thing. If you want to talk about things like equality of outcome, then you've immediately got a problem. Because on the one hand, you could say things that kind of sound good. Everybody should earn the same amount of money. We should have the same outcomes. Okay, but what do you do about somebody who's willing to work harder versus somebody who's not? Is it right that those two people should earn the same amount of money? Now, all of a sudden, people are going to start to back off and say, well, yeah, I can see that. If you're working harder, you should earn more money. Well, that flies in the face of equality of outcome. Now, what makes much more sense is equality of opportunity. That is, give everybody the same opportunity. And some of you will succeed and you'll succeed marvelously. Some of you will fail and you'll fail dismally, but everybody had the same opportunity. And what you find in kind of a weird way is if you accept the premise of equality of opportunity, then you must also accept the premise, the outcome of inequality of outcome. because those two go together. Conversely, if you want equality of outcome, you have to impose inequality of opportunity. So you're in this very weird space where it's not possible to be for or against equality. You could only be for or against a particular combination of equality and inequality.
And when we think about that, there's always basic trade-offs. There's you can't always have one thing or the other. It's not a binary choice. It's always a trade-off, right?
Oh, yeah, everything's a trade-off. And this is part of where, people say that, they call it economics the dismal science, and people don't invite economists to cocktail parties because we're just a wet blanket. Somebody will say something like, well, we should have free education or free healthcare or something like that. And everybody starts agreeing, and wouldn't the world be wonderful? And then along comes the economist and says, hang on, it comes at a cost. There are always trade-offs. If you want something, you got to give up something else. And the question is, what is it you're going to give up? And all that economists do is take that concept of trade-off seriously. And so, anytime somebody says we should have X or we should do X, the economist is going to say, okay, but it comes at a cost.
Absolutely. It's a great point. So now that we understand how to think from first principles, I'd like to talk a little bit about incentives and the unintended consequences that they can create. So why don't we use the example of how the incentives of politicians and bureaucrats end up being far different to what their electorate thinks that it should be, and how the information voting cost ends up creating a system that is far more geared towards lobbyists than actual voters.
Yeah, and this is what I refer to as the magic wand of government. People seem to have this idea that politicians are a different brand of Homo sapien than everybody else. And so we say, well, we want better societal outcomes. So we have to elect people whose goal it is to pursue the common good. And that sounds wonderful and it sounds noble, but you're looking for a human being who doesn't exist. Human beings, and they're good human beings and not so good human beings, but all of the human beings pursue what is in their self-interest. Now, it doesn't mean that they're selfish. It means that they're pursuing things that they perceive to be good. Now, I might perceive things to be good only to myself. I might perceive that helping others is good, but people pursue things they perceive to be good. Now, take that in light of politicians. Now, what's a politician want to do? Well, you can imagine a politician who wants to actually pursue the common good versus a politician who wants to get elected. Now, if you put those two politicians in a campaign, I guarantee you the one who's going to win on average is the one whose primary goal it is to get elected. Why? Because that's his primary goal, is to win the election. The other guy's primary goal may be more noble, but it doesn't lead to winning elections unless you assume that your voters are a brand of Homo sapien that doesn't exist. That is, the voters are intensely concerned with researching these politicians and figuring out what it is they're really about and identifying the person who's there for the common good versus the person who's just there to get a job. And voters aren't like that, right? So this idea of government as a magic wand works perfectly with a brand of human being that doesn't exist. But if you take the brand of human beings that do exist, the voters who we have concerns, I would like a better society, but the fact is I've got to pay my mortgage. I have to do my job. I have to, take care of the kids, whatever it is. And so the amount of energy I'm able and willing to spend tracking down and figuring out who's a good politician, who isn't, is very limited. And so I will have a tendency not to vote in the best possible way. Combine that with the politician who has the incentive to simply win elections, and you've got a recipe for disaster. Because what's the politician going to do? He's going to come along and say things like we've all heard recently. Elect me and I'll give you free tuition. Elect me and I'll give you free healthcare. Elect me and I'll impose a living wage. And all of that sounds good. And to the voter that doesn't pay attention, that sounds like the right answer. Let's go after that. The problem is the guy who's proposing it doesn't believe in it either. He's just saying words that gets him elected.
So, Anthony, maybe let's go through a couple examples of unintended consequences from, let's say, these feel good policies. So, I know, for example, healthcare, the Affordable Care Act. What was the outcome of trying to institute a universal type healthcare system in the U.S.?
This is an interesting thing. Now, I'll preface my remarks by saying that the healthcare industry is one of the most highly regulated industries in this country. So there's lots of moving parts here that have nothing to do with economics and have a lot to do with politics. But I could tell you some of the major forces at play. And one of the major forces at play is the fact that we look around and there are people who are sick, who are denied insurance. And we look at that and say, look, this isn't right. Just because you're sick, your insurance company drops you. And we should have laws that prohibit insurers from denying you insurance based on pre-existing conditions. And that sounds beautiful. But notice what happens. It gives the person, the insured, the incentive not to purchase insurance until he becomes sick. Because why? Well, there's no point in paying for insurance if I don't need it. So I get to save the money. I get sick. And I know that by law, the insurance company can't deny me insurance. So I purchase the insurance once I get sick. And of course, what that does is it dramatically increases the cost to the insurer of providing insurance. And so what happens? He passes that cost on to everybody else. And all of a sudden, we all find that our health insurance premiums are going through the roof. But they're going through the roof because of this rule that the government put in place. Now, let me go one step further and ask the question, why is it that we have a problem with the pre-existing condition business? That somebody gets sick and the insurance company won't give them insurance. And part of, it's not the entire answer, but it is a big part of the answer, is that we have tied health insurance to employment. That you don't go out and buy health insurance like you go out and buy car insurance. Rather, you get a job and the employer provides the health insurance. And so when you become sick, you're more likely than a not sick person to lose your job because you can't perform, you can't show up, all of this stuff. And so you're likely to lose your job. And when you lose your job, you lose your insurance because the insurance comes through the job. And then you go to apply for insurance elsewhere and the other insurers say, well, but you're sick. I don't want to insure you, right? If we have the pre-existing condition problem. So it raises the question, how come we link up health insurance with the employer? And the reason we do that is it is an unintended consequence of an earlier government intervention. And that is back in the 1930s, 1940s, the government was concerned about rising prices, and amongst the prices it was concerned about rising was wages. So the government put wage controls in place, and they said, employers, you may not increase the wages that you pay your workers. So what do? I'm an employer back in the 1930s, 1940s. I want to hire somebody. I can't offer them more money because the law says I'm not allowed to do that. So what I did instead is I said, okay, come work for me. I can't pay you more than you're making now. But how about this? I'll pay for your health insurance. And the government said, okay, yeah, you could do that. That's not getting around our wage controls. We'll consider that legal. And so all of a sudden, employers started offering health insurance. And then the government made it preferable by tax law for the employer to offer insurance. So if you get your insurance through your employer, it's tax-free, as opposed to if you purchase it privately, you have to pay taxes on it. So now all of a sudden, not only are the employers providing this health insurance to get around the wage controls, but now everybody wants to keep going because you get the tax benefits from having the insurance through the employer. And that brings us to the problem of tying up those two things, and that gives us the pre-existing condition. So long story short, this problem of pre-existing condition, one of the major problems that the Affordable Care Act was created to fix, that problem is itself the result of earlier government intervention.
Yeah, and I love the way you put it when I was initially listening to you explain that, it was inefficient or inefficient system to begin with, that you now imposed another completely inefficient system of government to patrol.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, that's absolutely correct. And what's happening is we passed the Affordable Care Act. It's been in place now for going on 10 years. And insurance premiums have not dropped like we were promised they would. They continue to rise at the same rate they were rising before. And so now we're talking about other things like single payer. Notice what we're doing. We see a problem in healthcare that was caused by government. So we turn to government, we say, fix this. They make it worse. So we turn to government again and we say, well, now fix it better. And they make it worse still. The solution is to get the government out of the playing field.
Absolutely. So maybe let's take one other example, Anthony, and that would be tariffs. Let's say, I remember you explaining an example of the U.S. sugar industry, and lobbyists basically were able to say, well, any sugar that's coming into the U.S. should be taxed, but that ended up creating all kinds of more unintended consequences, right?
Yeah, and this was a tariff that was in place for quite a few years, maybe decades, and I haven't looked into it recently. The tariff may have been rescinded, but if so, it was rescinded just in the past few years, and even then, I'm not sure it was. So put a big footnote on what I'm telling you here. The tariff, as it was a 300% tariff on imported sugar, and the reason it came about was because sugar cane is an equatorial plant. Of course, it grows well in equatorial environments. We don't have equatorial environments in this country. So if you're an American sugarcane farmer and you want to grow sugarcane, first off, you've got to be located in Florida or Louisiana, places that are already hot and humid. But even then, that's not equatorial. So you have to build this massive building, and within the building, simulate an equatorial environment. And then you can grow the sugarcane. Now, imagine the cost of doing all of that as compared with the sugarcane farmer in an equatorial country that basically just puts some seeds in the ground, gets sugarcane, and he's done. So what happens is the foreign producers can produce sugar at a third of the cost of what it costs the American producers to produce it. And the American producers go to Congress and they say, look, this is horrible. We can't compete with foreign sugar. And Congress says, okay, well, what do you want? They say, well, look, put a big tariff on imported sugar to make the imported sugar as expensive as a domestic sugar. Then we can compete. And that means more jobs and incomes for Americans and all the stuff that people say. And so the politicians, following their incentive, which remember, it's to get elected, look around at their voters and what do they see? They see on one hand, a bunch of voters who are associated with the American sugar industry cheering, saying, go tariff, this is going to be great. And people, other businesses who sell to those American sugar farmers also cheering and saying, yeah, this tariff is going to be great for our business, it's going to create jobs and all of this. And then the politician looks at other Americans who aren't associated with the sugar industry. And by and large, look, if you're not associated with the sugar industry, you don't know what's going on there. Again, you have your own concerns. You have your own job and taking care of your kids and mowing the lawn. You can't keep track of all these things that are going on. And so when the politician says, hey, I'm thinking about a tariff on sugar, basically from the other side, he hears crickets. So from the politician's perspective, he can generate a lot of positive votes by voting for the tariff and not create much of a problem by doing so. And so he votes for it. And in fact, the tariff is bad. Now, it's good for the American sugar producers, yes, but that good is outweighed by a larger bad that's imposed on people who buy sugar. So anything you buy from, soda in a can to a bag of sugar on the shelf to whatever it is, it's all more expensive because of this tariff. But we're not aware of it. In fact, I'll tell this story to my students and I'll say, and how many of you were aware that we had a 300% tariff on sugar? And no hands ever go up, right? I said, look, this is the thing. This is why we get bad governance. It's because voters, and it's understandable, voters are not fully engaged. And when they're not fully engaged, they leave the field open to politicians whose goal it is simply to win elections by telling us things we want to hear.
And that's exactly almost the exact same situation for something that you guys recently discussed on your podcast. And that was the virgin plastic tax, right? It's something like, I believe you guys said 90% of all plastics are virgin plastics, and they want to impose a tax on that, thereby just making everything you buy more expensive.
Yeah, that's correct. And, again, you can point to good effects. If we have this tax on virgin plastic, it encourages people to recycle. But the economist is going to say, as you pointed out earlier, there are always trade-offs. And the question is, are the trade-offs worse than what you have now? And I give you an example here. California, a couple of years ago, banned plastic straws along the same lines. They want to reduce the amount of plastic in the waste stream, and a lot of the plastic is coming from plastic straws. One of the big producers, or I should say sources of this, was Starbucks, that gives certain drinks with the straws. And so California says, enough of this. We're going to reduce the amount of plastic in the waste stream by banning the plastic straws. And absolutely, banning plastic straws will reduce the amount of plastic in the waste stream if you assume that nobody alters their behavior otherwise. But here's the thing, people always alter their behavior. In this case, Starbucks. Starbucks sells certain drinks that, are frothy, and if you try and drink it without a straw, it gets all over your face, it makes a mess. They need straws. The law says they can't have straws. So what Starbucks did is it designed a plastic lid that looks a lot like a sippy cup that you would give to a toddler. And that lid will keep the stuff off of your face. So it performs the same kind of function as a straw, but it isn't a straw. But here's the thing. Those lids use more plastic than the plastic straws used. So the end result of this well-meaning law was to actually increase the amount of plastic in the waste stream. It's an unintended consequence.
Another perfect example of it. So, Anthony, I would be remiss if I didn't touch on some economics with you. You created a video entitled 10 Myths About Government Debt that is absolutely excellent at explaining all of the issues around government debt. And if we could, I think it would be instructive to share some of that for our audience. So how do you go about conceptualizing the size of the US debt for people?
Yeah, the problem here is I'm going to say lots of words that have illion in them, right? So billion, million, trillion. And even when I'm doing the work, I'll sometimes get them confused, right? Because it all sounds the same, but there's huge differences. What we're talking about here is, on the one hand, the official debt. And by official debt, I mean money that the federal government has borrowed and it has promised it's going to repay. And this promise comes in the form of treasury bills. That is, and I haven't looked recently, in the numbers rising very quickly, but it's circa $28 trillion.
I looked right before our recording. It's 28.7 trillion.
28.7. Okay. So we're bordering on 29 trillion, and we're adding to that debt. Let's see, this year we should add a total of 3 trillion to it. We added 3 trillion to it last year, and I wouldn't at all be surprised that we add another 2 or 3 trillion next year. So we're at roughly $29 trillion, the amount of money the federal government owes. Now, let's put that in perspective. The U.S. economy in a single year produces on the order of $22 trillion worth of goods and services. So the amount of money the federal government owes is something like 130% of what we produce each year.
Just to interrupt you for 1 sec, Anthony, I looked on the U.S. debt clock chart, and it says our total debt to GDP as of, again, today is exactly as you're saying. It's 140%, actually.
140%. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. See, this is the thing. The last time I looked it up was like 6 months ago when it was 130, right? Mm-hmm. This is how fast we're adding to this thing. So 140% of GDP. So put that in perspective. That's like a household that has, let's say, $60,000 of income having $80,000 on its credit card. Mm-hmm. Right. And now imagine the stress you would be under if on a $60,000 income, you had to manage a debt of $80,000 on your credit cards, right? This is the kind of thing we're talking about. Now, detractors will say, well, hang on, a lot of that money, the $29 trillion, is money we owe ourselves. It's money the government has borrowed from the Social Security Trust Fund or from other Americans or what have you. And this idea that the debt is something that we owe ourselves is a word game, because there is no ourselves. There's me, there's you, there's the politicians, there's the government. And what has happened is the government has borrowed money from some of us. And if it doesn't pay that money back, those some of us it has borrowed from are going to be in a world of hurt. So it's not us in any sense. In fact, if you want to extend the analogy, take that argument, then by that argument, planet Earth is not in debt, because everybody on planet Earth who owes money owes it to somebody else on planet Earth. Now, clearly, that's ridiculous. That argument says that there is no debt, but clearly there is debt. And the fallacy is we aren't a single entity. We're a bunch of individuals. Some of us owe money to others. So here's the federal government owing $29 trillion. And that's not the end of the story, because there's this other animal out there that's called unfunded liabilities. And unfunded liabilities are not official debt. And by official debt, I mean, this is not money that the government is legally obligated to pay. However, it is money that the government has said it would pay. Largely, this is money that the government has told current workers that when you retire, we will pay you a certain amount in Social Security benefits. So it's promises the government has made. Now, those promises, and it's absolutely correct, those promises are not legally binding. At any point, Congress can say, yeah, you know what, we're not going to pay you your Social Security benefits. Legally, Congress can do that. The problem is, for the people who are expecting those payments, it looks exactly like that the government has defaulted. So you could call it what you want. The effect on the people who are owed the money is the same, whether it's a legal obligation or isn't. So those unfunded obligations, and if you want to dig into it, it's the total amount of money the federal government has promised to pay minus the payroll taxes it anticipates collecting in the future. So it's the net amount that the federal government has promised and will not have the money to pay. That's somewhere around, I've seen estimates as low as 100 trillion and as high as 250 trillion. And the fact is, even the lowest estimate is an ungodly sum that there's no way the federal government will ever make good on that. And I know it will never make good on that because it's not a question of politics. It's a question of mathematics. The math simply doesn't work. So what does that mean? What it means is, and this is coming down the pike in some time between the next 5 to 12 years, we're going to start to hear Congress say things like, we're not going to pay Social Security benefits to everybody, or we're going to pay some Social Security benefits, but not everything that we promised. Or it's going to start to say, you workers, I'm sorry, but you just have to pay more into the Social Security Trust Fund. But somebody's going to get stuck with the fuzzy end of the sucker here, whether it's the retirees not getting the benefits they were promised or the workers having to pay more than they were told they had to pay to get the benefits that they're expecting.
Absolutely. And I think one of the best ways that I've heard it described, Mark Yusko, a guest on my show, told me that if you spent $1 per second for 31,710 years, that would be $1 trillion. So that's that's about right. A good way to conceptualize how big $1 trillion is. Or, it's not even a good way to conceptualize it because that's still, so out of reach. But that kind of puts into perspective how big this number actually is, right?
Yeah, and I can help you out a little bit more there. The amount of money the federal government has borrowed is becoming so large, and I'm not even counting the unfunded liabilities, just the official debt of 29 trillion. The amount of money the federal government is borrowing has become so large that it is quite literally running out of places on planet Earth to borrow more. You can look at foreign governments, foreign people, foreign businesses, American people, American businesses, all of whom loan to the federal government, but they're not loaning enough for what the federal government needs to borrow. And who's been taking up the slack? is the Federal Reserve. And they can take up the slack because they print money. But then you have, because there's always a trade-off, when the Federal Reserve prints money to loan to the federal government, you then get inflation.
Absolutely. Anthony, maybe before we get into the inflation side of things, I'd like to talk a little bit more about taxes, right? Let's think about how we might conceptually pay for some of this stuff by, let's say, raising taxes. So why doesn't, let's say, taxing the rich work? And maybe if you could tell us what the effective tax rate that the government has earned as tax revenue has consistently been through the years.
Yeah. So the problem here with when we say tax the rich, this is a problem because we've run out of rich people. And what I mean by that is not that we don't have, many billionaires. We do. The problem is the amount the government needs to borrow has become so large, we don't have enough billionaires. So to put this in perspective, the total wealth, not income, wealth of all the billionaires in the United States is somewhere around $3 trillion. Well, that's this year's deficit. So if we confiscated not the incomes, but the wealth of all of America's billionaires, we'd be able to pay off the deficit, not the debt, just the deficit for this year. And that's it. Oh, and then we'll have no more billionaires. And not having billionaires means what? Well, we've got Amazon, but don't expect the next Amazon. We've got Microsoft, but don't expect the next Microsoft. We've got pharmaceutical companies, but don't expect any more. Because when you confiscate wealth like that, you take away from entrepreneurs the incentive to come up with new and better ideas. Because why do they do that? Well, some of them are just crazy people and enjoy doing that sort of thing. But a lot of them are expecting some sort of return. They're saying, look, I can really strike it rich by providing people with this new thing that they're really going to like. You remove the incentive for people to do that. So this, go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
So that's one thing with regard to the billionaires. You ask the question, what has happened with the amount of tax revenue the federal government has been collecting over the years? And this is really interesting. You can go back to the 1950s. So from 1950s to the present, more or less, the federal government has consistently collected about 17 or 18% of GDP as its tax revenue. And that number has been pretty constant. It does fluctuate, but it only fluctuates a couple percentage points. So it might go as low as 15, 16%, maybe as high as 22%. But it's basically a flat picture. This pretty constant 18% of GDP. That's how much the federal government has consistently collected year in, year out since the 1950s. But what's interesting is, over that same period, our tax rates have been all over the map. We've taxed the rich down as low as 35%. We've taxed the rich as high as 92%. We've taxed capital gains at very high, very low rates. We've done death taxes that are incredibly high and then all the way down to zero. We've done corporate taxes that run the gamut from 20, 30% up to 40, 50%. All through this 70 years, the federal government, has been adjusting all these various taxes up and down in various ways. And yet the total amount it collects year in, year out is a pretty constant 18% of GDP. And what that tells me is, for whatever reason, I can hypothesize what the reasons are, but for whatever reason, it doesn't matter who the government taxes or how much it taxes them. It's destined to get 18% of GDP regardless of what it does.
Absolutely. And it is crazy. Again, there's another great video that you did explaining all of that, showing higher tax rates for the rich, showing lower tax rates. And it is basically, as you said, just a complete flat line of approximately 17 to 18%. So Anthony, can't the government settle its debts by selling off some of its assets? We sit on something like 8,000 to 9,000 tons of gold, 500 million acres of land, and there's about almost $1 trillion of other assets the government has. So couldn't it fund some of its liabilities from these sources?
Yeah, that's kind of interesting. You say something like 8,000 tons of gold, and people say, wow, that's a tremendous amount of money, which it is. But do the math, and it doesn't come close to what the government owes, right? I think if you add up, and I've seen you can go online and find the balance sheet for the United States from the Treasury Department. They publish this. It's actually the books of the federal government. And when you add up all of their assets, the book value of the assets is around $6 trillion. $6 trillion. The federal government owes 29 trillion. So it could sell off all of its assets. And first off, if it did try to sell off its assets, the land, the gold, all of that, it would cause a dramatic decline in the price of gold and the price of land. So it's actually not going to ever collect a full 6 trillion. But even if in an ideal world, it could collect the full 6 trillion by selling off all of its assets, only comes not even 1/4 the way to paying off its debt. And oh, by the way, now it has no assets.
And that doesn't include the unfunded liabilities as well.
Oh, yes. Oh, yeah. And it's not touching the $100 to $250 trillion of unfunded liabilities. And this is where, I said earlier, it's not a question of the politics. It's a question of the mathematics. The math simply doesn't work no matter how you run it. The federal government I would say it is currently bankrupt. It just continues on because the broad majority of voters haven't realized this. But when they do, we're going to have some problems.
So I just want to pick up on something that you said there as well, Anthony, about that the value of land and gold, let's say, for example, would drop if they were to do this. Is this simply because of the huge glut of supply that there would be in the market at that point?
Yes, absolutely. And you get the same phenomenon when you hear Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren saying things like, we want to confiscate whatever she's saying. I think she said 2% of Jeff Bezos' wealth. Jeff Bezos is worth $100 billion, so 2% of that would be $2 billion. Well, here's the thing. Jeff Bezos doesn't have $2 billion cash. His wealth is almost entirely in Amazon stock. So to confiscate $2 billion of wealth from Jeff Bezos, Bezos would have to sell his Amazon stock. And that would have the same effect we're talking about here with land and gold. What would happen if Bezos tried to dump $2 billion worth of Amazon stock on the market? The price of Amazon stock would go through the floor, and he wouldn't come close to getting $2 billion. So too with the federal government's land and the gold. If it attempted to sell these things, it would drive the market prices of those things so far down, it wouldn't come close to collecting the 6 trillion that the books say it has.
Again, so many different trade-offs there. And interestingly, the last time I looked at the Federal Reserve assets, as you were saying, or the U.S. government's assets, they value the gold at something like $42 an ounce versus about being currently market priced at about $1,800. So I found that quite interesting of why they value it on their books as $42.
Yeah, this was the book value. This was the last time. That was the official value of gold when we went off the gold standard. Officially back in the 1970s. And so on the books, that's what it is. Now, you could say, well, it's really worth $1,800 an ounce or whatever it is. But then we're back to the problem of if you try and sell it, that quantity of gold, you're not going to get $1,800. In fact, you'll probably be lucky to get 42.
Great point. So I want to go back to another thing that you were saying here about that the government is basically bankrupt already. So the government only really needs to service its debt at this point and not actually repay it. So is this why we're on the road to inflating it away and really devaluing these dollars that it actually owes?
Yeah. So you raise an important point here, and I'm going to go back to my analogy of it's like a household with $60,000 of income being whatever I said, $80,000. Yeah, $80,000 in debt. Having $80,000 in your credit card. Now, the fact is, if indeed you found yourself in that unfortunate situation, you would know that you don't have to come up with $80,000. All you have to do is make the minimum monthly payments on the credit card, and you can keep on going with life. That's called servicing the debt. And so too the federal government. It owes $29 trillion. It doesn't have to come up with $29 trillion. all it has to do is make the annual interest payments on that. Now, the interest payments on 29 trillion are round about $750 billion. So it's a tremendous amount of money, but still, that's, it's the federal government brings in revenue 4 trillion. So it's affordable. The problem is this: that's just the official debt. If you look at the unfunded liabilities on the best case scenario, $100 trillion.
If that stops today.
Right. That's if that stops today. Even in the best case scenario, for the federal government to service those obligations would require that it spend 100% of its revenues simply on putting that money toward the unfunded obligations and putting that money toward the debt. It would have to literally shut down everything it does, with the exception of making good on its financial obligations. And so it's at this point that I say the federal government is actually bankrupt. It cannot mathematically make good on its obligations.
So, Anthony, how do interest rates play in here? If the government and the Fed institute some type of overt yield curve control, can't they just keep the party rolling forever?
They can keep it rolling for a while. They can't keep it rolling forever. And what's happened is they've kept this game rolling for several decades now. We've had remarkably low interest rates for a long time, and politicians will say things like low interest rates are good because it means that you pay less money on your mortgage. It means that student loan payments are less, and they point to things like this, and that's all true. What they don't tell you is that the single largest beneficiary of low interest rates is the federal government itself, because the interest it pays is also a market rate. So if the Fed can hold interest rates down, that means that the federal government's paying less money annually on its debt. So put this in perspective. Historically, the average interest rate the federal government has paid on its debt has been 6%. Sometimes higher, sometimes lower. On average, going back 100 years, it's been about 6%. Currently, with low interest rates, the government's paying 2.5%. If the Federal Reserve were to allow interest rates just to rise to their historic average, not even rise to a high level, just their historic average, it would cost the federal government about $1.5 trillion a year just for interest. The interest alone, over $1 trillion a year. And so you could see that I think what's happened is that politicians, through profligate spending, have painted the Federal Reserve into a corner. And the corner it's painted the Federal Reserve into is that the Fed finds itself, on the one hand, wanting to cut back on the money supply to control inflation. On the other hand, realizing if it cuts back on the money supply, it's going to drive interest rates up, which pushes the federal government ever closer to having to admit that it's insolvent. And so the Fed finds itself in the unenviable position of having to choose between two trade-offs. One of them is doing what's right by the people of controlling inflation, and the other is maintaining the solvency of the federal government. And given those two options, the Fed is going to have to come down on the side of keeping the federal government solvent. So that means that we're going to be looking at, I think, some significant and long-standing inflation in the future.
Absolutely. And it really, as you say, it doesn't leave them anywhere to go. And, it makes me wonder, or it doesn't make one wonder about the incentives here, right? Because there's really not any political appetite to really back off the gas because of the consequences. And, when we think about the unfunded liabilities piece of this as well, it seems like this or that class of debt is just going to keep growing at an exponential rate as there's the currency loses more and more value, and there are more and more promises being made to get the politicians be elected to be able to, keep running this show, right?
Yeah, this is right. And this goes back to where we started with the incentive of the politician. His incentive is to get elected. And one of the easiest ways to get elected is to say to the potential voters, look, elect me and I'll give you lots of stuff. Mm-hmm. And voters like receiving stuff. They don't like paying for it. And so what the politician has an incentive to do is to run up huge deficits to be paid for by borrowing. Now, there are two things that could have prevented us from reaching the point that we're at. One thing, and the thing that failed first, is constitutional constraints. That is, we have a constitution that says in Article 1, Section 8, a list of 8 or 9 things the federal government is authorized to do. And that's all the federal government is authorized to do. Our federal government, since about the 1930s, has moved far, far beyond that list of things it's allowed to do. And that has contributed to this runaway government spending, runaway deficit, runaway debt, because, of course, the more the government does, the more expensive it is. So that's item number one that could have held back the government and didn't, the constitutional constraints. But then there's a second item that even absent constitutional constraints could have held the federal government back, and that's a gold standard. That is, taking away from the Federal Reserve the ability to wantonly print as much money as it desires. With a gold standard, you can only print so much money based on how much physical gold you have in your possession. And if the gold standard were still in place, and I don't think there's anything magical about gold, it's the standard part that's important. If that standard is in place that would prevent the Fed from printing money, politicians would have bumped up against a problem. And the problem is, look, I want to spend all this money because I give things to voters and they vote for me. I can't spend it by borrowing because people aren't going to lend to me. Normally I go to the Federal Reserve, but they can't print money. So the only option available to me is to raise taxes. And the voters don't like that. And all of a sudden there would have been political pushback, that you'd get politicians saying, elect me and I'll give you free tuition. And immediately there would be a huge outcry of people saying, hang on, I know what that means. That means higher taxes. No, I don't want that. But because they can fund, because we are not attached to a gold standard, the Federal Reserve can print as much money as it wants. Politicians don't face that trade-off of spending versus taxes. They can just say, elect me and I'll spend the money and I won't raise your taxes. Footnote being, I'm going to borrow the money from the Federal Reserve.
Mm-hmm. So now that we're in this place of being able to print and quote unquote borrow as much currency as we want, we're going to see dramatic inflation, right? Or sustained inflation. And I believe the statistic is something like 20% of all the US dollars in existence have been printed in the last year and a half. So let's talk a little bit about inflation. Maybe tell us what some of, or the way most people understand inflation as price inflation, and maybe contrast that with the traditional Austrian definition of inflation, meaning the growth of the money supply.
Yeah, there are two ways you could use the term. In modern economic circles, when we say inflation, we tend to mean what you call price inflation. And actually, economists will also use that term, price inflation, that a rise in the average price level. A lot of people use inflation to mean a growth in the money supply. So economists would call that money inflation. But one way or the other, we understand what we're talking about here. And here's a good way to think about inflation. Picture a piece of toast, and you've got a certain amount of butter. And you spread the butter on the toast, and that's good. You have butter all over the toast, and you have nice toast. Now, same scenario. You take the same sized pat of butter, but now take a piece of bread that's twice the size. And now when you spread the butter over the bread, you've got to spread it much more thinly. And this is not as nice, right? And you can even go further and say the same pat of butter, but a very large piece of bread, and you toast that, and you've got basically no butter at all because the thing is so thin. That's what's going on here. A dollar has value because you can walk into a store and hand it to somebody and they'll give you something that you want. We call that the purchasing power of the dollar. The purchasing power of the dollar is like the butter. And the number of dollars out there, the money supply, is like the size of the bread. And as you print more money, you're increasing the size of the bread, but you don't have any more butter. You just got to spread it more thinly. So too here, the Federal Reserve can print money all it likes. That doesn't give us what we ultimately want. What we want are goods and services. I want to be able to walk into a bar, hand the guy a $5 and get a beer. Giving me more $5 bills does not make us have more beer. It only gives us more $5 bills. And so what happens? Well, the beer that used to cost $5 is now going to cost $10. Why? Because, well, we've got more dollars, but it's the same amount of beers we had before. And that is price inflation. As you see prices rise on average, the value, the purchasing power of your dollars is declining. Now, what's interesting here is when the Federal Reserve prints money, prices don't rise instantaneously. It takes time for that money that the Federal Reserve has printed to circulate throughout the economy. And as it circulates throughout the economy, then prices start to rise. And notice the fascinating thing here. When the Fed prints money and uses this money takes this money to loan to the federal government, the federal government now has this newly printed money, it starts to spend it. It's spending that newly printed money at the low prices. It's not until that money starts circulating that prices start to rise. And so you realize, well, wait a minute. I had $1,000 in my savings account that I was saving up to buy a big flat screen TV. And now I go to buy the flat screen TV and it doesn't cost $1,000, it costs $2,000. What happened? What happened is the purchasing power of my dollars was stolen. Where did it go? It went to those new dollars that the Federal Reserve printed and gave to the federal government. So to make a very long story short, when the Fed prints money, it has economically the exact same effect as if the government placed a tax on the purchasing power of your dollars. And the insidious thing here is, normally, when the government taxes us, it requires a vote. It has to go through the House of Representatives, it has to be approved by the Senate, it has to be signed by the president, and there's a whole bunch of discussion going on. But not so here. The Federal Reserve can print money. Technically, it's not a tax, but as far as the economics is concerned, it walks and acts and quacks exactly like a tax on your savings.
I think another great way of conceptualizing the purchasing power of your dollars is the desert island analogy that you use about being stranded on a desert island with $1 million, or a home, medicine, food, stuff like that, right?
Yeah, I tell this to my students when I start this discussion, and they immediately get it. So I ask them, I'll give you an option. I could put you on a desert island that has nothing. It's just sand, a palm tree, and you get a suitcase full of $1 million. Or I could put you on a desert island. I'm not going to give you any money, but there's a hut there, there's food, there's a refrigerator, there's air conditioning, there's medical supplies, there's Wi-Fi. Which island do you want? And everybody says, well, give me the second island. And I said, well, wait a minute. You could have $1 million if you pick the first island. And they say, well, rightly so, but it doesn't do me any good. There's nothing to buy there. And that's the whole point. Dollars have value only because they buy goods and services. If you don't have goods and services, the dollars don't have any value.
So, Anthony, where does all of this end up leading to? When does this loss of purchasing power begin to erode enough confidence in the currency that it starts to shift the time preference in holding the currency into a hyperinflationary type of scenario?
Yeah, I don't think we're going to see hyperinflation. And when economists say hyperinflation, they mean inflation in the tens of thousands or millions of a percent. I think Venezuela had something like 16 million% inflation for a short while, right? That's hyperinflation. We're not going to see hyperinflation. I think what we are going to see is remarkably high inflation compared to what we're used to. What we're used to in this country is around about 3% a year in, year out. I think what we're going to be seeing is going to be more like 10% plus or minus, maybe as low as 5, maybe as high as 15, and persistent, going on for the next decade, maybe further. And so It's not hyperinflation, but it is, compared to what we're used to, it's astounding. This is not the sort of thing that Americans are used to seeing. What's going to happen? One thing that's going to happen is people are going to start taking much more seriously a number of things. One is fiscal prudence, a government living within its means. Another thing they're going to start taking much more seriously, I think and hope, is cryptocurrency. Because cryptocurrency has this, most of the cryptocurrencies have this wonderful attribute that dollars don't. And that is that the Federal Reserve can't print more of them. And so all of a sudden, you've got this thing, whatever the cryptocurrency is, that will retain its value over time. And I could see quite easily people starting to shift and starting to do some of their transactions, maybe more and more in cryptocurrency, or maybe they do their transactions in US dollars, but they put their savings in the cryptocurrency. And politicians will respond. They're not going to like this. And so you're going to see more regulations placed on cryptocurrency, more taxes placed on cryptocurrency, anything that politicians can do to push people away from it and back into dollars. And why do they want you in dollars? Because if your savings is in dollars, when the Federal Reserve prints more money, the federal government can steal the purchasing power of your savings.
So do you think in that way that gold also suits that purpose of being a store of value?
Yeah, I think gold has historically served this purpose. And one of the economic benefit to gold, and I think people get some of this wrong sometimes when they'll say things like, well, the dollar needs to be backed by gold because gold has an intrinsic value. That's incorrect. Nothing has an intrinsic value. The value of anything is however much happiness it brings you. And if we did all of our transactions in gold, I would tell you the only reason gold has value is because I can walk into a bar, put it on the counter, and get a beer for it, right? Which is the same reason the dollar has value. Mm-hmm. The benefit of the gold isn't in that it's gold. It's that there's a fixed amount of it. And so the Federal Reserve is limited in how many dollars it can print because the quantity of gold in existence is limited. And that's the benefit with cryptocurrency, that not all of them, but a lot of them, the quantities are either limited, like in the case of Bitcoin, or they do grow over time, but they grow at a fixed rate, like Ethereum.
Mm-hmm. So how do you see the concept of a central bank digital currency in that vein then? I've heard you say that politicians have a knowledge problem and are very often working on outdated information. So if the government had a more real-time feedback mechanism to really evaluate how currency is moving through the economy, could this solve some of those lagging information problems that they currently have?
Yeah, it would solve some of the lagging information problems. So politicians would know much more quickly what's going on. But I don't think that's a good thing. It's not a good thing because what we're describing is giving a turbo boost to the entity that has created the problems that we're currently discussing. I don't want this entity to be able to do even faster what it's currently doing. And so, a digital US dollar doesn't solve any of the problems that I see cryptocurrency solving, and introduces new problems that cryptocurrency and, in fact, the US dollar doesn't introduce. For example, with digital dollars, the government can track every single transaction. That doesn't make me comfortable, right? Particularly in, let's take just one particular thing, talk about guns, which are, some people very much for them, some people very much against them. But here's the thing. With digital dollars, the government can track precisely who is buying and selling guns on not just from dealers, but on private transactions. And you might say, for example, if you think guns are a bad idea, that's good because we should be tracking that. Okay, but let's extend it then to things that you do like, I don't know, purchasing whatever. You want to purchase a used car from your buddy. Now, normally that's a tax. Well, maybe car's a bad example because there's paperwork in the background. I want to purchase my buddy's computer. It's a used computer. He's going to sell it to me for $100. Now, normally what happens? He gives me a computer. I give him $100 cash. We go our separate ways. With the digital dollar, the government can track that transaction and tax it. So now all of a sudden, there's no transaction going on anywhere that the government can't see. And one of the big groups of people are going to be immediately against this are the entirety of the wait staff coast to coast, who are used to having some of their income come in the form of cash tips that aren't reported. Yes, they're supposed to report them, but the fact is 99% of them don't. With a digital dollar, every single one of those transactions would be tracked.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think this is really interesting, and it really goes kind of to your earlier point about government just being this big bureaucratic mess on top of a market, right? So I know you and your co-host James Harrington recently talked about the eviction moratorium on your podcast, and also had a legal expert on to discuss the legality around it. So can you tell us a little bit about how the CDC somehow has decided that it has the authority to dictate policy on housing and not being the center of disease control as it's in name, right?
Yeah, and this is what I'm about to say is true. The CDC is true of every government bureaucracy. They don't spend any time worrying about whether they have the authority to do something. Their tendency is to just go and do it. And if somebody comes back and slaps their wrist later, well, that's later. And so what we had here was a case in which the CDC used some authority that Congress did give it to place restrictions on people in times of pandemic. For example, if there's a household that has some disease, and the CDC could say, no, people have to remain confined to this household, you're under quarantine, this sort of thing. But that power was given to be used in very specific cases. It was not a broad thing that they could just say, well, coast to coast, we're going to do the following. And what CDC is, it used the premise of that power to claim that it had the right, or had the authority to tell landlords everywhere, you may not evict your tenants for not paying their rent. And that's exceedingly troublesome because it's on several levels. One, it's the government stepping into a private contract, the contract between the landlord and the renter, and altering the terms of the contract. And if the government can do that, in the case of landlords and renters, it could do it in terms of any other contract. So, I contract with somebody to build me a house, and later on I decide, you know what, I don't want to pay as much as what I agreed to. Well, I could turn to the government, and it's already established it has the authority to alter contracts. It could step in and alter contracts. Say, no, he's not going to pay you this much. He's going to pay you something else. And so all of a sudden, all of the contractual relationships, and these are things that form a bedrock foundation for the entire economy, all of them get called into question. So that's one very disturbing thing. Another disturbing thing is it's the CDC that's doing this. The CDC are not a bunch of economists who are trained to think about trade-offs and implications and all of that, right? They're concerned with health. That's their expertise. So you got them issuing edicts in an area that is not their expertise. More than that, they're an agency of the federal government. They're an entity of the federal government. We didn't elect anybody there, and yet they're making these fundamental decisions that are imposed on the rest of us. And this is, and James Harrigan pointed this out as we were having this conversation, that there's one more disturbing thing, and that is the CDC shouldn't exist at all. And this goes back to what we're talking about. The Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution lists 8 or 9 things the federal government is authorized to do. Forming a CDC is not one of them. And yet the CDC exists.
Well, who's going to take care of public health then?
Well, and that's the interesting thing, because so often when I make these Article 1, Section 8 arguments to people, they'll say something like that. Well, who's going to do that?
Who's going to build the roads?
Right, exactly. And the fact is, the Constitution was designed to be a limit on the federal government. That kind of thing should be done at the state level. It's the states that would have the authority to found individual CDCs or pick other things, Social Security, Medicare, public schooling, all of that would be done at the state level. Now, when I say that to people, their response frequently is, well, but states are small. You need the federal government to handle stuff like this. To which I say, hang on a second. The same people who would say things like that are the people who point to places like Sweden and Norway and Denmark and say, look at how those people are doing things. Look at how Australia is doing things. We should do things like they're doing. Those countries are the size of states. Our 50 states are, not all of them, but a third of them, if they were separate individual countries, they'd be in the top 100 of countries by size. So anything a country can do, pretty much any of our states can do.
Absolutely. That's a great point. So you and James wrote a book called Cooperation and Coercion. So can you tell us if that's some of the types of things that you guys go through in the book?
Cooperation and coercion, we start off by noting that anytime humans come together, they organize themselves in one of two ways. Either we organize cooperatively, we do things voluntarily, or we organize ourselves coercively. We put somebody in charge, and that person has the authority to force the rest of us to do whatever the person says. And the entirety of the book is an argument that sometimes one tool is better, sometimes the other tool is better. And contrary to what a lot of people think, the tool that we should be using most often is not coercion, it's cooperation. And it's not coercion for many of the reasons we've been talking about now, the concept of trade-offs, the concept of unintended consequences. These sorts of things all arise and become very serious problems with coercion and not so much with cooperation. And so laying out that framework of this is how we're going to look at the world through lenses of cooperation and coercion, we look at all sorts of things. We look at gun control in this country. We look at the national debt. We look at minimum wage, and we ask the question, how has coercion made these things better, if indeed it has, or how would cooperation make these things better, if indeed it could? And in almost all the cases, and we do outline the exceptions, in almost all the cases, the answer is coercion. Using coercion tends to make these problems worse. Using cooperation tends to make them go away.
Absolutely. And it really, again, comes back down to incentives, right?
It very much comes down to not just incentives, yes, incentives, but also matching up incentives with matching up decision-making with consequences. Mm-hmm. That is, when the person who makes the decision is also the person who lives with the consequences of that decision, you get much better decisions being made. And when we use coercion, we break that link between decision maker and person who lives with the consequences. It's the politician who makes the decision, and it's the voters who live with the consequences.
Interesting. Anthony, do you have anything else you'd like to add to our listeners that have made it this far through our hour plus here? Anything you'd like to add?
Well, I'll say one thing that James and I keep going back and forth on, and my thoughts are not entirely clear, but they're becoming more so. And that's on the topic of universal basic income, or UBI. And the argument here from one side is, look, we should have a UBI to guarantee everybody in the country a baseline standard of living. And then from the other side, you get the argument that, oh my God, this is one more government program and we've got to raise taxes to pay for it, and so on and so forth. And I'm much more sympathetic to the second argument than to the first. However, there's a middle ground that fascinates me. And that middle ground is, if we had a UBI that guaranteed everybody got a check from the government every year for a certain amount of money that was just covered basic necessities. So everybody's got food, clothing, shelter, this kind of thing. And we instituted this program at the same time that we eliminated every single thing we do to help the poor. So no more public housing, no more energy assistance, income assistance, unemployment benefits. That's all gone. Social Security, gone. Medicare, gone. Medicaid, gone. Minimum wage, gone. Everything we do to help the poor, remove it, replace it with the UBI. And people who are pro-UBI start clutching their chests at this point and saying, oh my God, we can't do that. And I say, well, hang on. If you think that that's extreme, just raise the level of the UBI to cover what you think the whole is going to be after we take all those things away. And my argument here is not necessarily that UBI is a good idea. I'm not willing to go that far, but I am willing to say that UBI combined with eliminating the welfare state as it exists now is a better solution than the solution that we have now, which is the welfare state, and far better than the solution that I'm afraid we're going to end up with, which is the welfare state plus UBI on top of it.
Yeah, let the market decide what it needs most and providing this background level of support, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
It's an interesting idea. For those of you that want to check out Anthony and James's podcast, it's called the Words and Numbers, and it's available at wordsandnumbers.org. Also the book Cooperation and Coercion.com. And you're also available on Twitter at Anthony Davies. Anywhere else you'd like to point to, Anthony?
No, I think you've covered everything. But by all means, go out and buy our book, buy a couple of them. If you have an annoying relative who likes to talk politics at Thanksgiving, give them one of these books.
Perfect. Anthony, I want to thank you for your time today and for a really interesting discussion.
My pleasure. Thank you, Tom.